decided I was going to get back into the wiring of the Microsquirt and connecting it to the controls on the throttle body and sensors and so on. One thing that came up was, do I cut the harness that I've got? And I got thinking about it, and I do have an old harness from an 85 Laser, just a standard, not a turbo, that I had kicking around, and I've scavenged some fittings off it over the years. So I decided to start trying to find the connectors that I needed so I can splice into those for the Microsquirt, and that way I can have the schematic computer would still have its original sensors, and the Microsquirt would have its sensors, and all I have to do is plug in or plug out depending on which computer I want to run. So what you're looking at, I decided after a half hour of fumbling through the harness that trying to find an individual connector was going to be almost impossible. So I decided to just cannibalize the harness and reduce it down to just the connectors and 6 inches to a foot of wiring for each connector. So that's what I did. And what you're looking at in this pile are just the connectors that make up a harness. And this is the interior harness, the engine harness, everything's in this pile. What you don't see is 2.5 bags of wiring that's going in the trash. So this is the last half bag. I thought I would make this video about connecting the Microsquirt components. The reason I say that is because I've seen several videos on Microsquirts, but nobody actually shows how to wire the sensors and things into the controller. They all kind of just take it for granted that you can read the schematics and figure it out. So while I'm waiting on getting some other things done, I decided that I would start mounting my Microsquirt. This is the glove box mount. So I've mounted it in behind there. So the glove box fits right up against this surface, and there's room for the wiring and all the glove under, and it doesn't get in the way of your feet. Again, I've got the fuse panel under the carpet. So that's out of the way. The wideband controller is located over here under the kick panel behind this group of wires. My plans are to hopefully get the car started on the schematic controller, and then after I verify that it runs and all, and get the Microsquirt up and running, and then go back and forth between the two. I've got everything on quick disconnect plugs between the two systems, so I don't actually have to do any hardwiring. I can just unplug one, plug another one in. So we'll see how that goes, but I'm still a long way from getting it on the road. One of the additions I've made is the idle air control adapter that allows me to run the stock idle control, and that's on your throttle body up on the engine. So what I'm going to do, these wires go into this connector, replacing the wires that are already in there. So I'm going to, unfortunately, they didn't give me connectors for all the wires. So there are only 3 of the 4 wires that go in have connectors. So I guess I'm going to splice into the harness. Probably splice it about here. So I'll run these wires to the controller, and then these 4 wires will end up running out to the throttle body on the intake manifold. One of the things that ticked me off is they give you schematics, and both the Microsquirt and the adapters schematics did not match up to what I had. The wiring colors could be different. The labeling on the sensor wires could be different. So what I've done, first thing I found out was that my console fuse panel isn't a good ground source for the Microsquirt. You can connect the power which is coming through the ignition circuit on the panel, and the main grounds for the Microsquirt to the fuse panel, the console fuse panel. But all the sensors that come into it need to go directly to the Microsquirt wire. So there are two wires marked sensor ground. You can see that. And only one of them is documented. They're on different terminals. They're not connected together, so I'm assuming they still work because they both say the same thing. But all these sensors need to come back to the Microsquirt. They cannot go to an external ground, even if it's connected to the battery. So you got to make sure they come back. So what I've done is taken one of those ground wires, sensor ground wires, and put it to this terminal strip. I've jumpered the back of the terminal strip so that they're all connected together. And then I've taken the sensors. This is for the wideband controller and the IAC adapter. So the wideband control is down here, and that's the 0 to 5 volt signal coming off the wideband, and that's coming through this connector. And then the ground for that sensor comes up here. And I've also got my idle air control on the throttle body. That has to go through an adapter, so that's also coming up here and coming to the sensor, well, to the sensor ground. So there's also a white-black wire that's going out into the engine compartment, and that's where all the sensor grounds will be connected to out there. So there's two separate sensor ground wires. I'm using one for the interior, one for the engine compartment, and then that should give me good ground reference. But if you don't catch that little detail, you will get bit in the butt, because that's an important part of Microsquirt's operating properly, is to make sure that all the grounds are going back to the Microsquirt. These are the schematics that I redid, and I corrected the color of the wires. Some wires have stripes, and this is the idle control adapter. So if you note here, there are 4 wires that come off this, and that's just what's shown here, and they're labeled A, B, C, and D on the connector. I don't know if you can see that or not. So essentially, you've got resistance or sensors between the center two and the outer two, and they're both 50 ohm resistance. So just keep in mind that the circuits used for this, you got the center two and the outer two. Which ones are which, I can't tell you for sure, but that's what's shown here. And there should be a large link, a link to the large schematic that I did on this. But it took a lot of hours to change this over to be something that's more useful for wiring it in, because a lot of the wires were actually labeled incorrectly. We had old references to what they used to be, I guess. So there were new references that changed to these pins. So if you're trying to do it, it gets pretty confusing if you're just grabbing it and trying to do the installation. And there's also a table. So I also had to redo the main table that referenced all the wires, because again, correct names on the wires were not what was there. So these wires all come with labels already on them, like the coolant and IAT, idle air or intake air temperature. O2 sensor. So everything comes already labeled. That's one nice thing about it. And they also give you shielded cable for the crank sensor and the tach sensor. So that's a nice addition. But again, if you're working on or planning on doing the mini squirt, actually the Microsquirt, I'm doing the Microsquirt, really advised against it, because by the time you get done with all the conversion parts that you need, the wideband O2 adapter and the idle air adapter, you're getting up into the territory of the mini squirt, either the 2 or the 3. So if I had to do it again, I would just go buy a mini squirt 3 and get it over with. It goes straight in with all these controls without having to buy anything else. So that's it for this week's video. I'm going to try to do shorter videos so I can get more of them out, because the projects keep getting bogged down, taking longer and longer, and by the time you get done with them, weeks have passed. So I'll try to keep them shorter.